All right, there we go. Good. There we got it.
I hate tech makes me so nervous.
Don't worry, you got it. You nailed it. No worries.
All right. All right.
Yeah. Um, cool. So we're just waiting for Muzan, right? And the
Yes.
host, Yara, I believe.
Yes.
Cool.
Yes. I'm gonna try something to
Mm-hmm.
practice sharing my screen. I'm gonna share the flyer and have play some music in the background.
Cool.
And you can just tell me if you see it and just hear the music if that's all right.
Sounds good.
All right, do you see the flyer?
I do.
This is just a random song. It's not.
Shorty said she coming with a brick. I just wanna make the moolah. Yeah, the moolah.
Yeah.
Make the moolah.
All right. Great. All right. I think we're good.
Good. Good. I'm glad.
How are you doing today?
I'm doing good. When it comes to like the questions, I prepared some stuff more in the international kind of setting. So I'm eager to talk to Muzan to see if she'd be like cool to focus more on the local stuff.
Yeah,
Yeah.
perfect. Perfect.
But hoping for the best. I don't know. Like I'm kind of hoping to make it more free flow. Like I haven't really written a script or anything, but just kind of like, you know. Yeah. How
No,
about you? How you doing?
I am good. I am always a little nerdy, but I'm excited to just connect with y'all and learn from y'all, to be honest.
Good.
Yeah. So how, you know Promise?
Yeah, I mean only on social media. I don't know Promise personally.
Muzan delivery a new link, just resent.
Mhm.
There we go.
Muzan,
Hello, everyone.
hi, how are you?
Uh, good and
Not bad. Not bad. Can you hear me?
great, great. Yes, I can.
Good.
Great to meet you, Muzan. I'm Timmy.
How are you, Timmy? Same
I'm
here.
I'm doing all right. Thank you so much for connecting with us and making time to share all that you've been into and all the information and insights you're about to share. So I'm really, really grateful. And it's also great to just see your face outside of
Sure,
the.
and thank you for organizing this.
Yeah. So the connection is just a.
And please just let me know in case, yeah.
So it's slightly delayed, but when you're speaking, we can hear you great. So I think maybe I'll let Jaira know when she gets here that there's just a slight delay, but we can hear you great. And once you start talking, you can just keep talking.
Great, will do. And in case it gets, the audio is not very clear, then maybe I can turn off the video. Just let me know via text or something. So just in case that happens.
Okay.
And Muzan, I've prepared a lot of stuff on the more on the international side of things. What have you what dynamics do you want to talk about? Because I was just wondering like how because I don't really talk much about I don't really have much to say about the local situation.
Okay, so from my side, I think that for the first question, I'm gonna go through basically what happened, try to explain how this past 3 years shaped like the current moment and shaped where everybody stands and who everybody is. That's most of what I'm gonna try to focus on. Even for answering the following question, I also expected that you'll focus more on the international side and maybe more on the theory. I'll try to answer it as much as possible from experience, like from what we saw on the ground, whether it's the part of what imperialism means to us, what internationalism means to us. I'll try. I'm not gonna give a lot of theory. I'm not gonna give any theory actually. I'm gonna try to give the answer from the ground. I'm gonna leave the theory part to you.
Excellent, excellent.
Awesome.
I think that worked. We would work well together in that way. Perfect.
Yeah, I sense that from your email. That's fine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I haven't been there for a while. I don't want to speak on behalf of what's going on, you know.
Makes sense. Makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Amazing. Amazing. Are there any oh, actually, let me see. Where's Gyro? She should be here in a second, but so in that case, then we will direct the first question, maybe just directly to you, Muzan, to kick it off.
Sure.
And would you mind actually pronouncing your full name?
It's Muzan and Neil.
Muzan Alneel.
Yes. So the L in Alneel is kind of silent. It goes Alneel.
Alneel. Well, I guess Gyro will need to know. We'll need to, I'm gonna just be a black screen, so I'm gonna be tech, just making sure things go smoothly on that end. But great. How are you doing? You're in Khartoum right now, correct? How are you doing over there?
No, I'm not. I'm actually in Oman visiting my parents. Going back to Khartoum next week. Yes.
Great.
Yeah, looking forward to see how things are going on in Sudan. I've finally had the experience of seeing things from the outside and understanding that you do not see much from the outside. Like no matter how much is posted, all the videos, it's kind of not very easy to understand what's happening, you know? I even kind of stopped like tweeting or posting about stuff because I just felt like I don't think I know exactly what's happening. So I'm just gonna wait until I'm back, you know?
Yeah.
So I feel for you guys.
Yeah, I have no idea. You know, things move so quickly as well, and it's the internet's so full of like conflicting messages. You don't really know, you know, what's going on.
True.
You know, next week we're featuring, so we're doing kind of like a series, but next week we're featuring somebody who is going to be talking about the struggle in West Papua right now, over in Indonesia. So we're really excited about that. And then I don't know, in case y'all have any connections, or we've been trying to connect with folks around the struggle in Tigray, as well as what's happening in Somalia with the recent US military deployment there. So if you happen to have any comrades or folks that you think might be worth us trying to like connect with, would love to know.
I'll let you know if I think of somebody. Have you guys done anything on Myanmar?
You know, we haven't, but
Okay.
we are hoping to do like after the Black Internationalism Web Series, we hope to do something around like a pan-Asian popular struggle because of what's happening in Myanmar, because there's so little of the left in the West, at least, is talking about what's happening there.
Yes. Yeah, and it seems like for us, it seems like there are some similarities, like the coup and the way the UN mission is dealing with it. It's like if you listen to the UN representatives in Sudan and Myanmar, they're almost saying the same thing. It's almost irritating. Like they're repeating exactly the same words. So I was, very copy paste. So yeah, I'm interested to hear what's happening from their side as well.
Yeah, you know what? That's a good. I'm gonna write that down. I think we do have a couple connects we could talk to about that. I'm just gonna shoot. Y'all have any song requests to as the intro music while we let folks log on?
Nothing in mind.
Same here.
All right.
I've got some really messy notes. I just hope I hope that I don't screw this up because my notes are so messy.
I'm sure you won't.
I hope not.
So I think I'm gonna take around maybe 18 to 19 minutes for the first question. But don't worry, that's the only one that I'm spending a lot of time on. It's just that I need to give a lot of details to explain what's happening. But from there on, it will be like 3 minutes each.
Yeah. I mean, it's also fine if you want to spend the whole 30 minutes.
No, I think I'll lose people's attention if I go for 30 minutes. So 18 is, yeah. I wish
That's
I
good.
could make it less, but yeah, 18.
Okay. In that case, maybe I'll incorporate there is one local part. Maybe I can incorporate that part into my like 10 minutes from there.
Okay.
Okay. Good.
Hi, everyone.
Hello.
Hey, Jaira, welcome. We're just
Thank you.
getting settled. Welcome to, well, why don't we do some quick introductions, Jaira, since you're emceeing and going to be leading questions. So we could just do some quick introductions, and then Muzan and Mohammed, if you want to share to Jaira what y'all kind of landed in terms of focus, Muzan on the first question around context on the ground, and then, yeah, but want to start with some quick intros before we jump in?
Sure. I'm Jaira. I live in the United States in Massachusetts, and I've been a part of Dissenters for about a year, and I've been working on the International Solidarity Committee with Timmy and a few other people that are going to be joining today.
I can go quick, but y'all know me in the email threads, knowing you with dates and logistics. But name's Timmy. I helped co-start Dissenters. We launched in 2020. But just for a quick, too long didn't read version, was me and a bunch of other organizers in different sectors around environmentalism, Palestine solidarity work, diaspora organizing, and more generally, that felt there was a missing piece in at least in the US left, anti-war left, that was really dominated by an older white generation, and there wasn't like a unified kind of people of color led space for young Black, Indigenous, and people of color youth to lead on the issue of war and militarism. So we, started Dissenters to hopefully to really carve out a space where young POC could, one, be trained up on grassroots organizing skills, but two, also to support the leadership and voices of those most impacted by war and militarism, and try to bridge those connections. And so we launched in 2020. We got about 25 local chapters around the states, and we're a baby org, right? So we're still building out different committees. Now that our kind of ground game is emerging and developing, we're trying to build out these kind of national committees, which is the case for now I've pivoted to support the International Solidarity Committee to really try to make those international connections, but also specifically to really challenge some of the dominant anti-war left narratives in the US around internationalism, anti-imperialism, the different kind of lines in the field on those things. So yeah, that's a little quick piece. But other than that, in my day job, I help run a rad arts and education program inside a prison outside of Chicago, where I'm based, where we do kind of criminal justice outside prison organizing. But yeah, that's a bit about me.
Very cool.
Pass it over to you, Mohammed.
I'm studying right now. I'm doing my PhD in sociology, and I write every once in a while. I used to have a regular blog called Black Radicals, and I've just been engaged in different kinds of social movements. I've done a lot of work with the Kurdish Solidarity work here in England. I've also tried in my ways to reinforce or support the movement on the ground in Sudan. And I've done some mass incarceration work in Oakland, California, when I was there. Black Lives Matter as well. And I'm also active with Black Lives Matter here in the UK. And right now I'm setting up an organization called the Decolonial Center. And so the main idea for that is to advance the anti-colonial struggle in the 21st century. It's still just being set up, so it's still not public yet, but yeah, I'm trying to work towards building that, and with the vision of having branches around the world, with the kind of decolonial politics. And yeah, that's just about it. That's just where I'm doing now. Yeah.
Cool. I'm Muzan Alneel. I'm a political activist by necessity for most of my life, basically. I'm usually based in Sudan. Right now I'm speaking to you from Oman, where I went to visit my family. And I'm an engineer. Also have recently founded the Innovation, Science and Technology think tank for people-centered development. Short, it can be called Istinad, where we try to bring try to do something that is not so horrible with our engineering knowledge for a change, and basically to try to work with grassroots communities and providing what we do is being the think tank of the people. So we try to do basically what think tanks do, but with the priorities of the people, providing policy briefs and policy alternatives and so on to what we call in Sudan demand-based groups, which is something that is all over Sudan. In different kind of issues, farmers, mining issues, internally displaced people, farmers and pastoralist conflicts. So we work with different groups and try to provide innovation, science and technology solutions on that. Unfortunately, most of my time is not being spent on that, but being spent on the day-to-day struggles related to a very eventful set of years that we went through in Sudan in the past 3 years. But yeah, honestly, everything I did came out of necessity. There wasn't a big major plan in any way. So yeah.
Thank you both. Wow, so many connections, and one, just appreciation for everything that both of y'all are doing, and for connecting with us in particular. there's a lot of like overlaps there. But one thing I was gonna say is, so Jaira, I know you're gonna, before we jump into the questions, you're gonna share like basically the short bios, the stock bios that y'all have. So when y'all start, if you want to say anything in addition to that, and I don't know, anything that like in addition that isn't captured in your bios that you think that you feel particularly compelled to share with our particular audience, which is youth activists, you know, whatever you feel compelled to share there. But other than that, I think that's mostly it. Jaira, were there any other questions you had in terms of the flow of questions and stuff like that?
How would you like to be kind of like warned about time? I think Timmy's going to be checking in with me to let me know, you know, we're at 10 minutes, 5 minutes. Would you like me to just send a note in the chat and just say like 2 minutes left, 5 minutes left, or signals, you know, whatever?
Yeah, a text sounds good. And I was
Okay.
actually just telling them right before you joined that I will spend a lot of time in the first question, given context, around 18
Okay.
minutes. But don't worry about that. For the following questions will be like an average of 3 to 4 minutes maximum.
Okay, perfect.
Awesome. Let's see. Okay, then last thing before we transition, and when we transition, I'm gonna share my screen to show the flyer and then play some intro music right when we go live. Oh, actually, captions. All right, I turned the live captioning on. Do folks see the live captioning at the bottom of the screen?
Mhm.
Jaira, you see it?
Mhm.
No.
I think you're unmuted. Mo.
Oh yeah, maybe because I'm a panelist, I don't see it. But Jaira says
Yeah, I'm not seeing it
Yeah,
either.
I can see it.
Okay, do you see the options at the bottom? There's like a more, and then there should be like a live transcript or something.
oh yeah.
You don't need to turn it on because I think the purpose is for the attendees.
I learned something today.
Yeah.
So now you can see the live transcripts.
Yes.
Mhm.
Great. So I'm gonna have it on mine since I'm recording it and we want to have the institution. But why don't we do something we do in Dissenters is just before we move into like events like this, just do a quick like set a quick intention for, you know, the vibe or energy you want to bring into the event. And we could just end there, and then I'll go ahead and share screen and play music, and we'll go live at exactly noon. Does that sound all right?
Yeah.
Cool. Jaira, maybe kick that off with like a energy intention.
Right now for us?
For you, yeah. What's something you want to hold on to as we move through the panel?
Well, I think, you know, for us in the United States, I think a lot of people are feeling not very, very sad or frustrated or just angry with the state of affairs here with the massacre that happened. And so I think maybe I would like to set an intention of revitalizing hope and an exchange that makes us all stronger and connects us all to each other, and allows us to learn how to stand up to a government that we feel is allowing deaths of innocent children to happen over and over and over again.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll go quick, and I want to channel, well, just gratitude, open ears as somebody living in the heart of empire, and ways to do this work better as an internationalist. And then third, persistence in this work, trying to do anti-militarist work. So yeah, either of y'all wanna?
Yeah, I hope that that my introduction to meeting all of you great people at Dissenters will, you know, will deepen my commitment to an internationalist politics myself. And I hope that we could all kind of move or advance the struggle in ways beyond just solidarity and towards collective organizing. And I really like the vision that you all have. So I'm really excited to learn just from the questions and from how this is received and on all of that, for sure.
Awesome. Well, from my side, I'd say I hope that we keep expanding our imagination of what's doable, because that's what I see whenever I look back at the past 3 years, because it's tough times now, but honestly, looking back, we came a very long way, and yeah, we went further than we expected it can go. So what's doable is a lot, and that's what I want to hold on to.
Beautiful. Thank you all. Oh, hey, Asha. Hey, Asha, we're just closing out our intentions for the session, but if you want to quick say a hello and introduce yourself before we, I was going to just share my screen with the flyer and music.
Hi, all. Good to be here. Excited for today's conversation. Yeah, I'm Asha. I'm one of the co-directors at Dissenters, and I'll be live tweeting the conversation today.
Awesome. All right, I'm gonna turn off my video. I'm gonna share the flyer and start playing the music, and then I'll go live at noon. And I think, so Jaira, I'll give it, say 2 to 3 minutes, and then I'll fade out the music and then stop screen and take it away. All right? Great. All right, I'm gonna wait till noon. I wanna, this is one of my favorite songs, so I gotta get the full song.
Cara, deixa essa voz também. Não, já voltei, ficou maneiro, velho. Tá bom, vai. Já vem, já vem. Já vem, yeah. Não acho que eu preciso dizer. Não acho que eu preciso dizer. Não, não. Não acho que eu preciso dizer. Não acho que eu preciso dizer. Não, não. Quanto tempo a gente ama? Quanto tempo a gente precisa pra viver? Quanto tempo a gente quanto tempo a gente precisa pra viver? Esse amor vale mais que só bolsa prata. Pra elas o Lucas não vale nada. Mas meu som te deixa excitada. Quando você precisou eu tava lá. Fui pra Madureira pra me procurar. Veio na minha vivência pra me iludir. Eu ia até Los Angeles pra te encontrar. Mas hoje eu tô achando que é melhor assim. Me disse yeah, yeah, tipo como quem não se importa mais. Ela nem se importa mais. Na verdade ela nem disse yeah, yeah. Eu que fiquei cansado de correr atrás. Mas olha pra mim agora, literalmente pelo mundo afora. Parece que o jogo virou. Não tento entender o que mudou. Eu joguei meu coração fora. Aquele seu dia está no meu armário. Levi's dele. Não acha que é São Paulo, eu tô no Brooklyn. Deixei ela tipo como assim. Mas olha pra mim agora, literalmente pelo mundo afora. Parece que o jogo virou. Não tento entender o que mudou. Eu joguei meu coração fora. Não acho que eu preciso dizer. Não acho que eu preciso dizer. Não, não. Não acho que eu preciso dizer. Não acho que eu preciso dizer. Não, não. Quanto tempo a gente quanto tempo a gente precisa pra viver? Quanto tempo a gente quanto tempo a gente precisa pra viver?
Hello, everybody. Welcome, everyone, to the first discussion of our Black Internationalism Web Series hosted by Dissenters International Solidarity Committee. And the subject of today's discussion is solidarity and resistance in Sudan. My name is Jaira, and I'm a member of Dissenters and a part of the International Solidarity Committee. And I'm so excited to be with everyone here today, and especially to be joined by our amazing guests, Muzan Alneel and Mohammed Elnaiem. And Muzan Alneel is a co-founder of the Innovation, Science, and Technology think tank for People-Centered Development, ITS, INAD, Sudan, and a non-resident fellow at the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy, focusing on a people-centric approach to economy, industry, and environment in Sudan. And Mohammed Elnaiem is a PhD student at the University of Cambridge, where he studies the relationship between capitalism, slavery, and patriarchy. He writes a regular column on Black history for JSTOR Daily entitled Black Radicals. So we're really excited to have these two brilliant people helping us contextualize, understand, and get a little bit more information of what exactly is happening in Sudan. And so, Muzan, given your proximity to Khartoum, where many of the demonstrations have been taking place, I want to say for close to a year now? We wanted to start with you. Earlier this week, we read reports that demonstrations were taking place again in the streets of Khartoum and Durman. Can you introduce yourself and tell us a bit about the movement and community building and resistance work that you're a part of? And how should we understand the political moment that you and your community are in? And who are the dominant forces and institutions shaping the crisis?
Well, hello, and thank you very much for having me. And thank you to everyone who joined and decided to invest their time in understanding the revolution taking place in Sudan. My name is Muzan Alneel. I'm a Sudanese socialist and a political activist based in Khartoum, as you said. And I will try to give the main sequence of events in the past few years, actually, that led to the revolutionary moment in Sudan that we are experiencing today. So in 2018, the Sudanese people first took to the streets in opposition to the government that was in place at the situation, a rising inflation of over 60% at the time. That's in official numbers, let alone the reality, a scarcity in basic commodities, and mainly an increase in the prices of bread, which is a basic part of the urban diet in Sudan, and a good portion doubled in December 2018. So a loaf of bread that used to cost £1 was priced at £2 overnight. This triggered a protest by high school students in the city of Atbara in northeastern Sudan, and people who were already enraged by the economic situation, and and the people who were made poorer every day. They joined those high school students in protest, and the protest burned the headquarters of the ruling parties. A photo of that infamous building in flames was a positively shocking scene to most Sudanese people. It looked, the building itself looked like every ruling party headquarters around the country, and there were many of them. There was one in every city. They were all green, huge, and they all stood in contrast to the poor houses that surrounded them and the poor people that surrounded them as well. The ruling party that at the time called itself the National Congress Party, and actually called itself a number of different things over the years, but it was the National Congress Party at 2018. It was in power for nearly 30 years at that time. They came to power through a coup in 1989, which ended a short-lived democracy and ruled with militarization and oppression. The National Congress Party, or the NCP, held an Islamic ideology that it started to compromise and give up on in the last couple of decades in order basically to gain acceptance from the international community. the party created a regime that placed the country's resources under the control of the security apparatus or directly under the control of the ruling party itself. They detained and killed and created paramilitary militias, started wars whenever they needed, basically in order to exploit the country's resources and people for 3 decades. So it was exploiting, it was the extraction of oil, then it was the extraction of gold. And for those reasons, wars were started all over the country in different ways. To see their building in fire was a sign that they can be brought down, which is something that was not very realistic to think of right before that. So the protests that started after that, they did not stop. People protested in every city and village around Sudan for the following 4 months. So that's from December 2018 till April 2019. And the newly formed Sudanese Professional Association, that's an association of labor unions, basically showing protest schedules, and the masses followed those schedules religiously. So at 1 p.m. of every defined date, people took to the streets, whether twice or thrice a week. This happened again and again for 4 months. And the Sudanese Professional Association, the SPA, issued a document that was titled the Charter of Freedom and Change, calling for the end of the existing regime at the time and a transitional government with a set of defined tasks that included ending the war, improving the economic situation, and a set of other issues. The SPA formed then an alliance, basically, with a number of established parties who signed the charter and named themselves the Forces of Freedom and Change, according to the name of the charter itself. So they were named the FFC. These parties were not popular among the masses. They were basically bourgeois parties that represented the interest of commercial and agricultural capital. It also included the Sudanese Communist Party, an old and established party that promoted an alliance with what it called the national capital, and then a number of smaller parties. They were all seen by the public as parties that often create alliances and break them, switching enemies to allies and vice versa, with no actual or real impact on people's lives. Now, 2 important things happened in the months that followed the announcement of the new alliances. And these are things that we need to keep in mind in order to understand some of the important pivot points that took place later on. The first being that the FFC, those old and classic leadership of the opposition with the new name, they started rephrasing the narrative of the demands. So the economic demands kind of took a step back for issues such as liberal freedom, political participation, and so on. So talking about bread became heard less and less. And what was often repeated that this is not a revolution of hunger, but a revolution of consciousness. And it was very important for them to repeat that and to make that the slogan of the revolution. And we'll see how that impacted things in the following 3 years. The second important thing that took place at that time was in February 2019. So by that time, it was 2 months of ongoing protests, right? The Sudanese Professional Association called for the formation of what it called the Neighborhood Resistance Committees. Neighborhood Resistance Committees are a model that was previously brought up in different years and decades throughout political activity in Sudan, but not as big as it was made due to this call by the SPA. The idea was to create those committees that will organize protests on the ground in several neighborhoods simultaneously, and basically to use this decentralization of protests to weaken the security apparatus of the regime. And it was successful. The idea was very successful, actually. The SPA continued to issue the weekly protest schedules, and the committees took it from there. They were the ones who will then organize in their neighborhoods to make sure that there are people, the pamphlets are ready, whatever it is that is needed. There are people in checkpoints to check for the police where they're coming from, everything on the ground that was needed to make the protest successful, and it was very successful. It is, I think, important to note over here that there were no clear channels from the committees back to the SPA to participate in decision making regarding the protests. So they were just basically expected to be the soldiers on the ground, not without an actual voice in the decision making regarding what are their demands or what kind of protests will take place or when or how and so on. Nevertheless, the protests continued and they got stronger and gained more supporters. And in more areas, and we started seeing them getting bigger and bigger, and kept going on for another 2 months up until April 6, 2019. For that day, there was a call for a central protest that is supposed to head towards the military headquarters of the armed, or the headquarters of the armed forces in the middle of the capital. It was a huge protest that basically paralyzed the capital. And this protest turned into a sit-in that surrounded the military headquarters for the following 58 days, demanding the end of military rule and a civilian government. These 58 days also included protests and strikes and days of civil disobedience and marches, marches from neighborhoods to, marches from neighborhoods to the sit-in, or from ministries and institutions to the sit-in area, and it expanded. So it was recreated in another 13 states out of Sudan's 18 states around the military headquarters in each of them. And we have a lot of military headquarters, as you can imagine a military regime will be. It's worth noting over here that the day that the sit-in started, which is April 6th, was the anniversary of Sudan's second uprising in 1958, which brought down another military regime at the time after 13 years. Our first uprising was the October Revolution in 1964 that brought down another military coup regime. So our history since independence has been basically of 3 military coups. 2 of them at the time were ended by popular uprisings, and they were followed by a transitional period that was a compromised one, and then a short-lived democracy that gets interrupted by another coup, and the same cycle starts again. So that has been our history for like 70 years since independence. In 2019, we were in the streets trying to end the third coup. And as we were in the sit-in for those 58 days, the political elite, the FFC, went into negotiations with the military. They were trying to have another compromise, just like the ones they did in the past 2 uprisings. So while the masses kept chanting for 100% civilian government, literally that was the main slogan, and to no compromise, the elite wanted some kind of a partnership or some kind of power sharing situation with the military. This contradiction got to its peak in the end of May 2019. The people went into a 2-day strike under the slogan 100% civilian, but at the same time, the elite were coming out of negotiation rooms and wanted to convince the people of a power sharing setup with the military. While it was clear by then that this contradiction will not be solved, the military did what is expected and attacked the sit-in. They attacked the sit-in in 14 cities simultaneously at the same time. That was the morning of June 3rd, 2019. That's when the massacre took place. And right now in Sudan, when you say the massacre, people just know that you're talking about the massacre of June 3rd, 2019. More than 100 were killed. Some of them were tied to bricks and thrown into the river. Tens were raped. This was followed by a month of violence, internet shut down around the country. And it was a violence that was designed basically with the military as a price for some stability and safety. this compromise was clearly rejected by the people who utilized what the previously formed neighborhood resistance committees to organize under this total internet and communication shutdown. So people worked and called for a central protest against the military within less than a month after the massacre on June 30th, 2019. It was a huge protest of millions, basically, that took place in the streets of the country, in the capital, in cities, in villages, including in IDP camps of internally displaced people. It was everywhere. Millions of Sudanese people came out, and our total population is 40 million. So when millions come out, that's huge. People basically went out against a regime that they saw commit a massacre just a few weeks ago. So it's not that they were not afraid of dying, but we knew that there is no living under military rule. That was very clear. So people did expect to die. They said their farewells basically before going out. And it's important to remember that we had no idea how big or small it will be, this protest will be, because we were not able to communicate. We were under a communication shutdown. So we just went out with the chance that we will be the only people out, or maybe there will be millions others. And there were a million others, to the extent that people in the streets started suggesting to move towards the presidential palace, because we saw that there was enough of us to take over the palace. Another thing is that the violence of the police and other state, other tools of oppression of the state, whether it's the militias, the army, and so on, it was rather limited in comparison to what we saw a month ago. So that also supported this call for going towards the presidential palace. However, the FFC leadership talked people out of going to the palace. Now, later on, months and months after that, we found that the FFC has actually met with the military prior to the protest, just a day prior to the protest, and agreed on restarting the negotiations, despite the massacre, despite literally the blood on their hands. And although the protest then showed, the strength of the masses and showed the popular consensus against the military, the FFC leadership still worked in the following weeks, not just on that day, to convince people of a partnership with the killers. So honestly, what we saw that at that moment was clearly what Lenin described as leaders of the petty bourgeois befogging the people. They were befogging the consciousness of the people and their understanding to make it seem as this is the wise thing to do, that we need to make some kind of a partnership, regardless how strong we seem. And they worked very hard to make people believe that, that the wise and only solution is a partnership with the criminals. And this was an approach that was supported by regional counter-revolution powers such as Egypt, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, as well as the EU and the US, who reportedly at the time stated that the interest of the US in Sudan is whatever is the interest of Saudi and Egypt. And their actions showed this thing, regardless whether it was leaked on a newspaper or not. So a partnership government was then announced in August 2019. That's less than 3 months after the massacre. And it was welcomed and applauded, of course, by the international community, who for the following 2 years complimented the new government for taking all the necessary action to bring Sudan, back into the global market, basically, what they call the global community, but let's say just the global market. This included economic liberalization, desubsidization of basic goods, to the extent that bread loaf that people started protesting when it got to a price of £2 was priced at £20 within 18 months of the new government. But it was still, the beloved government of the EU and the US. The new government basically implemented the same neoliberal policies of the old regime. And this explains for me why it was very important for them to deprioritize economic demands at the beginning of the revolution, because they knew that their interests lie at the same place that the interest of the previous regime is, and that they will take on the same policies. So they presented all these policies that they implemented as necessary actions to reform the economy and to receive, of course, more loans from the IMF and the World Bank and international donors or loan sharks, basically. The Sudanese people were told that their country subsidizing their fuel and bread is unnecessary spending, but at the same time, Sudan was asked to pay over $300 million to the US which is the richest country in the world, as reparations for the crimes of the previous regime. The IMF did not object to this spending. It was not unnecessary all of a sudden. It was a clear blackmail that was welcomed by the international community. The blackmail of the international community that we were subjected to also included the normalization of relations with the Zionist occupation over Palestinians' lands. And to reject any of these counter-revolutionary actions, you will get yourself labeled as enemy of progress, and even perhaps a sympathizer with the old regime, or with the National Congress Party regime. So over those 2 years, we actually learned that propaganda is mightier than the gun. The economic policies that the NCP regime could not pass with direct oppression and with wars were easily passed with the support of visits from US American representatives and raising the Sudanese flag in the EU headquarters and all these blah, blah, blahs. And during this time, the people of Sudan were just getting poorer and poorer. The demands of the revolution were being forgotten. That includes even justice for those killed on June 3rd massacres. As you can imagine, the criminals became partners in the government. So of course, there will be no justice for the people they killed, for their victims. The neighborhood resistance committees faced kind of a dilemma of being eager to object to this deviation from the revolutionary path, but facing the label of being called enemies of the revolution if they were to protest against the acts of the new transitional government. It's basically that the propaganda of the transitional government managed to equate themselves with the revolution itself. So thereby objecting to any actions or decisions that are being taken by the transitional government is which are anti-revolutionary itself. Any objection to those actions was being called an objection to the revolution itself. So again, it was a lot of propaganda for 2 years, the following 2 years, and therefore the protests against the actions of the transitional government were always labeled by the elite as opening a path for a military coup and enabling the military partners that the elite themselves shook hands with. It was a very confusing time, I can say that. And under this tricky situation, the resistance committees continued to organize protests with carefully phrased slogans such as correcting the path of the revolution and supporting the civilian government. They're trying very hard to always maintain a distance between them and the military and always show that we are objecting to certain issues we are doing, but we are in support of the civilian government. The economic policies of the transitional partnership, the transitional government, has also led to making the Sudanese people poorer and poorer every day. And no spending was put into health or education or basic needs and services and so on, which led the resistance committees to take on these tasks that should be done by the state, such as bread distribution, cleaning the streets, maintenance of schools, organizing free health checkups, everything that they could do using their own resources. And at that time, the FFC and the SPA, the Sudanese Professional Association, then the Forces of Freedom and Change, they kind of they assimilated with the military and alienated themselves from the masses. And at the same time, the resistance committees grew deeper into their community. They are no longer just the people organizing the protests, but they're organizing the day-to-day life. Although we have to admit that many of the members of the resistance committees in this time also sank into confusion and into despair and disgust of the propaganda and the lies and the unclear positions of what they thought is the government that should represent them, at least the civilian side of it. So for the 2 years of the transitional government, it's important to remember that the government did not form a parliament. We did not have anybody representing the people. There was no institution representing the people. Laws were passed basically in hiding. Some of them we didn't see until they were passed, and some even weeks after that. They provided close to nothing to the people, and even handed the issue of peace talks with the armed resistance fully to the military half of the government, which led later on to the formation of an alliance between some of the armed resistance groups and the military. The following coup that took place last October, on October 25th, 2021, it was a coup that the support of this coup came from this alliance of the armed resistance and the military against the, well, kind of against the civilian elite, although they still don't mind them as a partner. So on the morning of the coup, the Sudanese people woke up to military vehicles in the streets. That was 7 months ago. There was a communication shutdown. The civilian cabinet was detained. And despite no communication, the people just went out to the street. As early as 6 a.m., people were out. They headed towards the main streets as well as the military headquarters. It felt as if people wanted to push restart on the battle from where it stopped on the morning of the massacre. They just, without no one talking to another, we couldn't even talk to another. There was a full communication shutdown, but people just went to the streets and they were heading towards the military headquarters and the main streets. One of the most repeated phrases in the following weeks, on that morning of the coup and the following weeks, that was repeated by the people in Sudan was the return to postponed battles. And that's how people felt about the situation, because for 2 years, the elite told them to put their battles with the military criminals on hold. And now they can finally restart it. And it just felt like clarity is back. We know the enemy again. It's not confusing. We know who's the enemy and we're going out against the enemy. The protests over the following 7 months, it's been 7 months since that morning, they were led by the resistance committees themselves, no longer by the SPA. The resistance committees over the past years to work on everything they had to work on, they formed coordination bodies at different levels. So it was not just a resistance committee in the neighborhood, but there's a coordinating body in the district level, in cities, and in some states on the state level. There is a coordinating body for all the resistance committees. The main slogan of the protests over the past 7 months have been the 3 no's, what we know as the 3 no's. That's no compromise, no partnership, and no legitimacy for the military. It's clear that this slogan is coming from the learning of the losses of the previous compromise. And for 7 months, the coup has not been able to form a government or appoint a prime minister due to these protests. Although in November 2021, the coup and the previous prime minister, who was brought out of a 1-month detention by his partners, they announced a deal that brings him back as a head of the new cabinet. And the deal was praised, of course, by the EU and the US, and the UN General Secretary asked us to be reasonable and just accept it, and we did not. And it seems that the propaganda of the realistic lost some of its appeal over the past 2 years, and thanks to the lessons learned. So people saw that it was not realistic to imagine that a civilian and just government can be formed by a partnership with military criminals. That's the not realistic part. It's not that continuing to protest is not realistic, but to expect that a partnership with the military will lead to the demands of the revolution being realized. So the protest continued and the deal failed. The United Nations mission in Sudan continued to call for negotiations with the military coup that basically legitimizes the coup. These are negotiations that the majority of the resistance committee and the masses continue to refuse and continue to see as repeated attempts to force a government of criminals on the Sudanese people, and ignoring the deaths of 96 protesters who died over the past 7 months at the hands of the military, peaceful protesters, basically, and the detention of hundreds and thousands being injured. But the UN continue to ask us to wisely ignore all of that and sit down for negotiations with the military, with the coup, basically. And basically for them, crimes, fake stability that only benefits business interests of a few, basically, and the continuation of extraction of resources from Sudanese land. In the same time as the UN and the international community continue with their failed attempts, the resistance committees have evolved. They've drafted their own political charters and roadmaps towards forming the new government, the biggest of which is called the Revolutionary Charter for People's Power, which is signed by resistance committees in 15 of Sudan's 18 states by elected neighborhood councils. We've had labor associations and unions emerging and organizing. There has been several strikes. Right now we have a strike of the judicial. Basically, all the courts are on strike. We have strikes. We've had strikes of teachers. We've had several strikes over the past period of the petroleum sector and so on. We had several demand-based groups that are being formed and taking direct action to protect their interests. So basically, this makes the current battle that we have in Sudan is one that is between masses organizing on one side, bourgeois representatives supported by the international community on another, and a military supported by counter-revolutionary regional powers, and also selected by the international community as their preferred partner, definitely over the possibility of a government of the people. So while this story lacks, of course, a lot of details, but I think and I hope it does provide a good, basic foundation for understanding the current situation in Sudan. And there are a lot of writings out there explaining the details, but this is kind of the basic story.
Okay, thank you so much for that. That was incredible context, inspiring context, really enlightening. I definitely I have so many questions I wish I could ask right now because that was an incredible rundown of the history. So thank you so much for that. I'm sure other people feel the same in the chat. A lot of people are dropping some questions in there. That was so very powerful and enlightening. Thank you, Muzan. Yes, I totally agree. And so we're going to now also bring Mohammed into the fold to talk a little bit more about what internationalism means to you and how did you arrive there? And does Black internationalism specifically mean anything to you? And how in your mind and why are these concepts important and reflected in the work or movements that you're involved in? Because as we heard, there's this incredible sense of unity and activation and organization in the Sudanese people that that is very much located around their national context. But I'm curious, and we also heard a little bit from Muzan about the connections between, just the kind of geopolitical context around Egypt and UAE and the United States. So kind of thinking outside of those boxes, how does internationalism play into the scope of Sudanese solidarity?
Thank you so much for that wonderful question. And just thanks for an amazing analysis, Muzan. You always do such great analyses and you really hit the point home on what the Sudanese revolution is really about. I think on the question of internationalism, I think it's really important to understand that it seems, at least to me, and others may disagree, that the left seems to be going through a crisis in terms of trying to define what it means to be an anti-imperialist, because one of the biggest expressions of being a leftist and being an internationalist is through an uncompromised anti-imperialist position. But anti-imperialism doesn't mean siding with one side of an imperialist camp. Whether we're talking about the transnational corporations, which I think organizations like Dissenters do valuable work in organizing against, who benefit regardless of who's fighting. There's our armed companies, the security contracting companies, etc. Or whether we're talking about different types of imperialism, of big aspiring nation states with clear imperial ambition. Right? To be an internationalist means to recognize that at least since the fall of the Soviet Union, but even before that, the vast majority of terrains for social struggle against authoritarianism around the world have invited imperial competition. And imperialist competition means that if you want to be committed as an anti-imperialist of the kind that a Black internationalism is supposed to be made of, it doesn't mean siding with one state over another state. I think what I'd like to really underscore, and in addition to what Muzan has talked about in the situation in Sudan, is the Sudan being a terrain of imperialist competition, different types of imperialisms competing with one another, right? So we talked about the agreement where when people were out on the streets demanding full civilian partnership, there was the liberal elites representing agricultural and different forms of state capital went into a negotiation with the military. We also know that Declan Walsh at the time had basically been privy, who's a New York Times journalist, to the fact that the people who organized and facilitated that meeting between them, it was as the protesters were marching towards the Republican Palace, as things seemed to be going out of control and the watchword of stability was going to be run away. That is, as the prospect for a proper, real revolution was going to take place, various international powers came together to pull the emergency brake. And one thing to understand about imperialism is, before imperialism is about putting boots on the ground or soldiers on the ground to go and fight your wars for you, for your resources, it's almost always about pulling the emergency brake. When we first, as the left, developed our own concept of imperialism, it was at the onset of the First World War, where the world itself, which was being increasingly carved up by monopoly capitalists, there was nowhere left to carve up. And so in order to pull, and there were various attempts to pull the emergency brake. For example, the scramble of Africa stopped all of these European powers fighting in Europe. The scramble had already begun. The scramble was only to formalize it. In that same way, if you want to take that as a kind of analogy of what's happened in Sudan, there were various interests that were involved who wanted to make sure that things were stable for their own interests. And one way in which they could do that was to ensure that there could be a civilian and military partnership, because full civilian government would only be in the interests of some parties, and full military government would only be in the interests of other parties. Right. And I think that, like, it's really important then to kind of underscore who all of these different imperialisms actually are. And this is the best way in which we can sort of understand how to approach Sudan, right? And so there's also just another element that's within the context of Sudan that's extremely important. The economic dimension to a lot of what was happening in the competition between the civilian sector and the military sector of the partnership had much to do with figuring out how to distribute and how to take over capital. Okay, one of the interesting, I could say, institutions that developed over the course of the revolution was called the Empowerment, Elimination, Anti-Corruption and Funds Recovery Committee. It's a very long name, it's a mouthful, but basically it's called the Empowerment Removal Committee. And the main idea of this committee was to expropriate the resources of the former Islamist regime and to then supposedly give them back to the people. Right, but that committee itself became it was really a threat to everybody involved, and it was also not just this. It should give us hope as leftists that in this world of there is no alternative to neoliberalism, we saw the creation of an institution set up specifically to expropriate the resources of millionaires and billionaires and supposedly give them to the benefit of the people. But there's a caveat to there as well. Okay, to really understand what was at stake for all of the different groups involved, Sudan itself, under the military dictatorship, developed a vast apparatus, a military and security apparatus, and it had companies involved in the production of gold, oil, gum arabic, sesame, weapons, the import of fuel, wheats and cars, telecommunications, banking, etc. And within a year of its formation, the Empowerment Removal Committee had recovered 20 million square meters of residential land that was in control of the former Islamic capitalists who controlled things, 1 million acres of agricultural lands, 50 companies, 60 organizations, etc. But the question then becomes, first of all, what to do with all of those resources, right? And more importantly, it's also really important to understand that the military themselves were the ones with the creation of what they call the Military Industry Corporation, which by name, you know, is directly related to a military industrial complex. They had control over the vast majority of Sudan's economy, and they themselves wanted to protect that, because the Empowerment Removal Committee was targeted at the people who could have their resources safely taken away from them within that context. But it wasn't targeted at the military and the Rapid Support Forces, which was a militia that is part of the military council, which controlled the country. And so after the coup happened, immediately the leader of the Empowerment Removal Committee was thrown in prison, as with many others. But it would also be a mistake to think that the Empowerment Removal Committee itself was a revolutionary institution, because on the other side, it was being manned by people who weren't necessarily against the vast inequality that their work implied. I mean, they had 50 companies, 60 organizations, 20 million square meters of residential land. Many of them just wanted that kind of information to be in the hands of others, maybe the aspiring capitalist liberal class. Right. But to understand that as then the economic base in which imperial competition takes place, it's really important. So let's first of all talk about all of the different types of imperialisms that were at place, that were operational during this time in Sudan. The first, for example, we would say would be the Western imperialism, right? And to really understand how Western imperialism works, you have to understand it from the mouth of the transitional and unelected prime minister. Immediately after taking power, the Hamdok, the prime minister, said to the international community that we are ready to enter into the international market. And he said, and I quote, "This is the last frontier. The rest of the world has finished its infrastructure projects." What this means is, foreign direct investors from around the world come to Sudan, and we will create an environment for you to come and invest. Okay. Now, the language of Sudan being the final frontier should be something that gives us pause. Okay. It should give us pause because the one important thing that Gallagher and Robinson, for example, noted in the 50s about imperialism is that imperialism isn't only annexations. It's by informal means, that is, through the use of local intermediaries for the purpose of foreign capital. So by informal means where possible, and by annexation when necessary. Really, you want to annex immediately if you've got no other options left, right? So to understand, for example, let's go back to Iraq, right? To understand the kind of approach that the United States has towards its own imperialist projects, right? In September 19th, 2003, as the US was occupying Iraq, Paul Bremer at the time, on September 19th, 2003, issued an immediate kind of declaration. And he said, first, that all of the public enterprises of Iraq should be privatized. Secondly, that the foreign firms should have full ownership rights over Iraqi businesses. That third, there should be repatriation of all foreign profits. And that fourth, the Iraqi banks should be open to foreign control, and then Iraq itself should close barriers to free trade, right? And in the beginning, of course, most people said an occupying force doesn't have the right to do these kinds of vast transformations of the economy to open up Iraq to the international market. And this was, of course, also against the Geneva Conventions. But David Harvey was very smart to note that Bremer's rules, open quote, may have been illegal when imposed by an occupying power, but they would become legal if confirmed by a sovereign government. And so this is why it's really important to understand that the kind of blackmail that Muzan's talking about, and the expectation of Sudan's so-called sovereign government in a civilian military partnership to do that, amounts to a kind of imperialism, but it's a very dangerous and insidious kind of Western imperialism, because it presents itself as being just economic common sense and economic orthodoxy. But in fact, but it is incredibly violent. So in the case of, just for example, the United States, and the International Monetary Fund, Muzan talked about how the civilian military partnership was compelled by the international community, a Black country, an African country, to pay reparations to the United States. But beyond that only, the International Monetary Fund had what they called the Highly Indebted Poor Countries Initiative. They would forgive your debt, but under the condition that you do massive structural reforms, including cuts to necessary fuel and electricity subsidies, the elimination of the devaluation of the currency, and very important, the partial publication, so publicizing all of the state-owned enterprises, okay? And within the United States, for example, in January 2021, the US released what they called the Sudan Democratic Transition, Accountability and Fiscal Transparency Act. And this basically said Sudan should transition to democracy, but not the kind of democracy that the Sudanese people are demanding, but the kind of democracy that they want. But more importantly, it also required as a precondition that Sudan open up civilian control over the states, the companies owned by the states. And of course, this was going to be through the Empowerment Removal Committee. And you can see that in the law itself, in fact, I have it right here with me, there is a paragraph which says that Sudan would have to open up then these to friendly foreign governments, and the United States was going to help Sudan distribute these resources to the people. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't want to see what that looks like. Something tells me it's going to be looking a lot like the Bremer Doctrine that happened in Iraq, which would mean instead of these means of production basically going to the Sudanese people, it would immediately be transferred into the hands of foreign capital and perhaps Sudan's aspiring liberal capitalist elite. And so that's how how Western imperialism, specifically through what they call the Paris Club, which is Austria, Belgium, Canada, Denmark, France, Germany, Italy, etc., the United Kingdom, and the IMF and the African Development Bank and all, etc., is demanding Sudan restructure its economy for foreign direct investment. And this is a kind of very insidious and dangerous kind. But then there's other kinds of imperialisms as well. And one of those is actually Russian imperialism. Now, the day after Sudan had gone through the coup, Russia went to the General Assembly and said that there was no coup in Sudan. It didn't exist, and that if you just try to mention the existence of a coup, then this is in fact foreign interference. And the reason why Russia did this is because Russia has, through a Nazi paramilitary group, which has been destabilizing Africa for years now, the Wagner Group, has its interests in Sudan. Yevgeny Prigozhin, one of the oligarchs who's tied closely to Putin, had cut a deal with our former dictator, Omar al-Bashir, in the Sochi summit in 2017. And this is where Bashir famously said that Sudan would become Russia's key to Africa. And that deal was for a transnational corporation called Eminvest, which belongs to Russian oligarchic capital, to have concessionary rights over Sudanese gold. And in response, this guy, who also controls the paramilitary force of the Wagner Group, would send his people to Sudan to defend the regime. They'd provide aid in disinformation campaigns using the internet. And in many situations, and in response, Sudan would export gold. And in fact, right now, part of the buffer that Putin has used to prevent the sanctions from damaging the Russian economy has been the export of vast amounts of gold through Eminvest in airports across the country. And now they are also in negotiations with the military regime to have a port. And then finally, there's also the Gulf powers. And this is a new kind of aspiring imperialism, which many people aren't recognizing. You know that right now in the Horn of Africa, there's a new kind of scramble going on between the various Gulf powers. On the one side, the United Arab Emirates is entering into political alliances and military base agreements and port contracts in places like Djibouti and Somalia. It has excessive influence over the political affairs of Ethiopia. And in Sudan, they hedged their bets with the military and have tried to defend the military coup, even though they fall under quote unquote the US camp in global affairs. They have tried to defend the military coup against all odds. And then finally, and then there's groups like Saudi Arabia. So Saudi Arabia right now, because of its going through a crisis in its animal fodder cultivation, and because it has depleted groundwater reserves, is in need of vast tracts of agricultural land. And its agricultural land it gets from Sudan. And so all of these different forces are hedging their bets on different groups. The United States is trying to back the aspiring liberal bourgeoisie in trying to support them in the hopes that they can open up and they can unleash Sudan's capitalist potential to foreign trade and foreign investors. And part of this is, of course, just basic macroeconomic orthodoxy, but the other part of it also is actually corporate capture, the corporations that would benefit in the United States from Sudan opening up its capital. So they hedge their bets on the civilian side. And the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, Russia have hedged their bets on the military component. But ultimately, the partnership itself is just like the scramble of Africa was to prevent European powers from fighting with each other and for things to go out of control. The partnership itself is kind of a Faustian pact to see which bet wins, and that's why the international community, even though they disagree on what the nature is of the coup and who's right and who's wrong, they almost all ask everybody to return to the negotiating table and to go back to a partnership, even though the slogan in the Sudan streets right now is no compromises and no partnerships and no capitulation to this agreement. And so, if you have all of these kinds of conflicting interests, a proper anti-imperialist politics is to understand that not just Sudan, but much of the Horn of Africa, even places like Mali and even West Africa, is a terrain of competing imperialisms. And siding with one imperialist over the other is, for example, siding with Russia in the context of Sudan, is literally siding with the Wagner Group, which just a few weeks ago engaged in a massacre that killed 500 and has killed 500 civilians in just a period of 4 months in Mali, and has been doing so side by side with the Malian army, the military, and that to me, this is not this is an anti-imperialism of fools if you want to stand with Russia in a context like that, or even in the context in Ukraine, to be honest. So what we need then is to be very clear about the fact that we live in a world of competing imperialisms. We live in a world where the capital of all of these different countries needs an outlet, in the same way that it did in the dawn of the First World War, and that outlet is going to be the agriculture of Sudan and other places, the ports of Sudan. It's going to be in the state-owned enterprises of Sudan. It's going to be in all of these different things. And the imperialism in that sense is still the same as the kind of imperialism that Lenin described it as. But one thing to understand is that even Lenin, he condemned Russian imperialism, which was not an industrial country at the time, as vicious imperialism. And today we live in a world of many imperialisms. So we must understand that. And then finally, we just need to take a look at those groups and corporations which benefit, regardless of who's winning and who's losing in these wars. And these are, for example, the Omega Research Foundation has looked into the use of weapons which are not weapons that are not really called less lethal weapons, but we've seen them to be very lethal. And these are Brazilian companies like Condor Tecnologias, now Letais, I probably pronounced that wrong. One of them is a Chinese state-run factory called 9604, and they put their 604 markings on their projectiles. And there are various European and companies as well. And if you look into finally the finances of the military corporations and companies, a lot of those transactions go across the globe. They buy lots of Toyota vehicles, lots and lots of Toyota vehicles. So Toyota can't pretend that they don't know what's going on. And then they go to China and they buy practicals to turn those into war vehicles that end up coming and killing our martyrs in the streets. And they make these transactions and vast transactions with companies like IBM and laptop companies. And then they also make a lot of the transactions in the Netherlands and Germany. And all of this is documented in leaked financial documents from the Rapid Support Forces. So that's in a nutshell the international dimensions of it. But I'd like to just highlight once again the importance of that, the kinds of democracy promotion that the United States is engaging in, or the kinds of so-called anti-imperialism that Russia uses to secure its own imperialist interests, or the kind of stability that the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt claim that they want, is very different from the path that the Sudanese people, through the resistance committees, are trying to carve for themselves. And that is where our commitment as internationalists, Black internationalists, should be, because at the end of the day, the PR firms that work for the military are the same PR firms that are being used in Myanmar, and then they're the same. The same equipment is being used in all of these different places. And so, yeah, that's about it. I could go on for much longer, but I guess I'll leave it at that for now. So thank you all for listening. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much for that. You laid it out really beautifully and helped, I think, everyone get a fuller picture of this idea of how imperialism and internationalism are working together to kind of obscure, as you said, the real kind of demands and pushes of the Sudanese people. And so, Muzan, we'd love to hear your perspective as well on internationalism and how that plays into the greater dialogue we're having here.
Yeah, sure. Well, Mohammed covered a great portion of what's happening in Sudan. I would maybe just add some stuff about how we're experiencing this, how we saw it in our reality, how we understand internationalism, international solidarity, even from our reality. In our experience, we saw that international powers that share interest in our oppression, and people have to work together as well. And in reality, this the issue of oppression cannot be addressed in fractions or as part of the regime that oppresses us was supported by international partners to reinvent itself. As I told you, that the basic policies, basically the same regime serving the same interest, and it was those international partners who reinvent itself and protect its interest, even if under 20. But we have been protesting as well. And many of us believe that the US or the EU. However, what we saw after the uprising, after bringing down the NCP government ourselves, and it's important to note here that during the years maybe 2014 until 2018, the international community supported also a dialogue between the opposition and the NCP government in what they called the soft landing a model that instead of bringing down the regime, we will do some kind of a soft landing. We brought down the regime at the end, and we saw that after bringing down the NCP government, the international community again supported the same policies that we were previously protesting against, and they claimed to support us in that. It was their interest in exploiting our resources that took them to that side, basically. And we understood through this experience that a government that oppresses their people or other people cannot in any way be allies to people anywhere else. So, for example, in the past months, we saw, which is something that also Mohammed brought up, the issue of the situation in Myanmar, and we saw in a simple comparison between what's happening in Myanmar to legitimize compromises with military relations themselves are used to stabilize the world in a form that eases exploitation, regardless of the slogans they use and regardless of how many sustainable development goals they will ever phrase, they will always support our exploitation. Not our liberation by any chance. We also saw that in Sudan, farmers were ripped off their land and their water provide to the projects of Gulf investors that Mohammed mentioned, and that was supported by the military regime in Egypt and in partnership with the corporates of the Zionist occupation in Palestine, and strengthened by the imperial tactics and values of the US and the EU. We saw the militias in Sudan that were funded by the EU, basically to stop immigrants seeking a better life after their lands and resources in Africa were robbed by the same European countries. So our experience in Sudan displays international models of oppression and how connected in a very information and data. What we see in front of our eyes is clear enough, and thereby it also clarifies the contradictions between the steps and policies that our countries must implement to actually provide its people with decent living on one side, and on the other side between the steps and policies that the counter-revolutionary governments, whether in the region or in the West, must implement to maintain their control over our resources. So this contradiction became very clear in experience over the past 2 years, and it was this shameless display of international systems of oppression that groups who share the interest in a decent living for the masses, and that it can never be an alliance with those who are benefiting from the oppression of our oppression, basically, or of any oppression. So the Sudanese communities who are living in gold extraction areas, for example, who expected the revolution will end the economic activities that negatively impacted their health and environment. It was very clear to them that corporates that are benefiting from people dying, and it clarified their position. They were these communities that previously sought the support of the are not aligned with their interest as well. And if I may address also the issue of imperialism and capitalism, and how which Mohammed gave a very good explanation of, but let me again also try to address what was our experience of it in the past 3 years, because there was a lot of work done in the media and via think tanks and development institutions and all of that, basically to shape the revolution in Sudan as what they call the revolution of the youth against the alt, of the new against the alt, or mostly the youth was the word that was used. And this approach was also used across the region in many countries to confuse the analysis of what the revolution is and what it was against. And it was successful for some time, for a good amount of time, in befogging our understanding of what's happening. And it got some of us to accept counter-revolutionary policies because they were, presented. I'm sorry, I see. Is my audio clear, or would you like me to turn off the video so it will be clearer?
Yes, it's a little choppy, so if you don't mind going audio only.
Sure, sorry about that. Okay, sorry for the bad internet quality, guys. So what I was saying is that this whole phrasing of the revolution as the revolution of the young against the old, we saw that it managed to get some of us, or a good a good portion of us, to accept counter-revolutionary policies, basically because they were presented by this young minister or that young representatives. There were other narratives such as a revolution of the periphery against the center, and it did not define the periphery as the exploited, who are exploited by the centers of wealth extraction and management, but as an ethnic divide. And the transitional government, for example, used this narrative and appointed a manager for the Sudanese Company of Mineral Resources, which is the institution, the governmental institution or governmental company, who was supposed to supervise mining in the country. And this manager was from an ethnic group that is mostly exploited by mining companies. And this was presented as a win for the people, because you had one of your people managing this company. And this worked for a few months. But however, people who are directly impacted by the reality of exploitation on the ground, they were the first to see what's behind this befogging and these charades. And I remember listening to a man from an area that is impacted by gold mining, and he was telling the story of how often they went to the Sudanese Company of Mineral Resources, which is supposed to prioritize the interests of the Sudanese people. And they went there to present the harm inflicted on them by the private investor companies, and how the governmental company always took the side of the investors, not of the people. And this man, he used the term the company and its sisters, referring to the governmental company and the private investors. And he explained that they are sisters in interest, and therefore they will never take the side of the people against the shared interests of maximizing profit. So it's through these on-the-ground analysis, we managed to understand the shared interest of capitalist parties and systems, and how we cannot expect them to be our allies. And it was also the lack of class analysis that delayed this understanding for some time, and helped the exploitation to continue. So, for example, right now the revolutionary charter for people's power, which I mentioned earlier, for example, this charter starts with an analysis of the economic relations that shaped the exploitation of our part of the world by the government of your part of the world, and it shaped, and how it shaped why we are pushed towards deindustrialization and to remain as providers of cheap raw material, basically to sustain imperialist powers. This understanding is, of course, very important, because it's only as useful as we implement it in our political stances and in our daily interactions and in the decisions that we make regarding how we deal with these powers, whether in the West or in the region, or even their local allies. I'd also like to address. I see a question about how the transitional government addressed the issue of women's rights, for example. And I think it's somehow related to the issue of propaganda and turning and rephrasing the narratives into some kind of a cultural war. Because what happened is that we had a government that congratulated the women with every kind of International Women's Day, days against violence against women, whatever it is, took very few actions regarding women's rights. One of the actions that they celebrated, and actually was also celebrated by the EU, was some changes to the law that allowed women to travel with their kids without the permission of the father, which was unnecessary if a woman wanted to would travel with her child. And the funny thing is thinking about what's the percentage of Sudanese women who can afford to travel. So whose interest are you actually serving? It's great that we had this change in the law, but this change in the law literally served like 5% of women. There's like 50% of the women who have issues of being basically unpaid labor in the land that is owned by their families, but you never address the issue of land tenure and land ownership, because this will jeopardize the interest of agricultural capital, who are main partners in this government. So this is how the issue of women's rights, of minority rights was used. It was used as propaganda, and it was used to serve, EU events, but it had very little to no impact in the lives of people. And actually, it kind of made people angry, made the majority of the population angry about the attention being given to these issues, and therefore had a negative impact on people who are trying to seriously address the issue of women's rights and minority rights, because people took out their anger at the government on these groups, basically.
Thank you for that. That was also just another incredibly enlightening round of explanations and answers that really helped give a fuller picture of what it looked like on the ground. And so from there, I mean, it's very clear that both of you have super sharp and clear analysis and are able to kind of understand the context that are driving the kind of revolution and these mobilizations forward. And so we're curious how communities based in the US, like those of us at Dissenters that are already ready to take on imperialism and profiteering off of war and repression, and how can we support these struggles from where we are so that we're in deeper solidarity with the Sudanese people?
Yeah. So so for one thing, I think we can map out all of the different interests that are involved in trying to undermine the struggle for, real democracy in Sudan. The struggle against austerity in Europe and the United States is intimately tied with the struggle against austerity in Sudan, because in Sudan, it's austerity and cuts on subsidies. These are seen as economic common sense, and they shouldn't be. And so that struggle is alone really important. It shouldn't be, Americans shouldn't accept austerity, and they shouldn't accept its export. Then there are the interests of money, regardless of who's winning or who's losing. They don't care about which side. And I'm thinking, for example, of the PR firm led by a former Israeli intelligence agency. I think his name is Ben Manash in Canada. Who's been using his service as a foreign agent to defend the interests of the coup regime in Myanmar, to defend the interests of the Rapid Support Forces in Sudan, and to defend the interests of dictators all around the world. And so there's a whole vibrant industry of that. So fighting against the lobbyists is also another one. I think what Dissenters is already doing in terms of fighting against the big corporations who profit from war is already excellent, and that should be deepened and continued. And then also just to really focus on on how there are groups that can be named that you find consistently in various different places. The Wagner Group, for example, in Russia, and also like I said, all of those lobbyist groups in the United States, and then also just like things like Sudan being shaken down. Sudan had overthrown a government. That government did fund Islamist terrorist groups back in the 90s, right? Including the bombing of the U.S. embassy in Kenya. But for the United States, which refuses right now to pay reparations to its own African American population, to demand the shakedown of an African country of people who overthrew the government that committed those crimes, and to demand them to pay 300 million while people are starving, that should be on the radar of anti-racist movements and the reparations movement in the United States. And so I guess what we're going to need to do first is we're going to need to redefine our anti-imperialist analysis so that we're ready, and we're able to really understand all of the different corporate and political and economic and international financial institutional interests in affairs that affect us all. Because that is directly how, for example, the struggle for free education in the United States is tied with the struggle for us to not lose our free education in Sudan, you know? And so these are all the kind of just to be, yes, the main enemy is at home, but that includes, for example, in Russia, the same is true in Russia, the same is true in China, the same is true in many of these big powers. But then at the same time, we also need to understand how our struggles are not separate, right? Because of the exploitation of gold in the peripheries of Sudan, right now, Russia has reserves of gold, which is protecting it from the inflation. And we learned about these gold reserves and this big gold exports from the defense minister of the Donetsk so-called Donetsk People's Republic. And so, you know, these connections, they're there, you know, so we just need to map them. And then we need to develop our campaigns based on these mapping exercises.
Well, if I may add to the great points that Mohammed mentioned, and yeah, I think, of course, we all agree that a more just world requires that we all win our local struggles for justice. That goes without saying, but also other specific actions in the case of Sudan is, you know, call for an end of the imperialist interventions by the American government. You know, we're often asked by think tanks and media and whatever, what the US government should do to support protesters in Sudan. In my opinion, it should just stop all that it's doing right now. You know, it should stop pushing us for a compromise with the military. It should stop providing the coup with talking points by calling protesters unrealistic. It should stop legitimizing coup leaders by sending its representatives to meet with them and so on. But of course, this US regime will not do that. I think we all know this. And this US regime, which is linked to the continuation of the control of the petrol countries and the prioritization of their security and the continuation of their reign, it will not jeopardize them with the possibility of you know, a real pro-people democracy in the region. It will not jeopardize the occupation of Palestine by the possibility of a real pro-people democracy in the region. But what comrades and pro-people and pro-democracy individuals in the US can do to support is to first always understand the imperialist and capitalist motivation of their government and to analyze the position of their government accordingly. And second, to put pressure on the US government against those actions. And third, and I think is for me the most important, it's in addition to mapping the interests of capital and of lobbyists and so on, there's also mapping the actions of governments, which is there's a lot of information that that you have access to, or you have better potential of reaching that will help us if being made public about what are the different arms of the US government are doing in our country. So for example, we have a State Department funded program that got involved in shaping the peace agreement in Sudan in 2020, the same peace agreement the Juba peace agreement that led to the alliance of the military and some of the armed resistance and then created the base and the support of the coup. There are the ongoing USAID programs that aim basically to co-opt and corrupt the resistance committee and force them to join the dialogue with the military coup, which the committees have rejected repeatedly. Now, for us, we hear those as rumors. As American citizens or residents in America, you might have a better chance to access this information and to make them public and to help us understand the attempts to manipulate us and to manipulate our people's future. I think this is the main practical action that I believe can help us, and also just help a wider group of liberation movements to see and analyze and combat similar attempts that are being done by the US and other imperial governments in different parts of the world. And I think it will have a major impact for us to understand how things are shaped, because those arms of the US government are shaping our reality behind the scenes, and we have very little access to understanding how they're doing it, although it is kind of public information, at least in their country of origin.
Awesome. These are some incredible directives that I definitely think we can take into the committees, or if anybody isn't a part of Dissenters yet, if any of this really gets you going, we'd love to have you join as well. And so I want to ask a question from Jenny Joy. What was the law that the US passed trying to restructure and access Sudan's economy?
Sorry about the delay in switching on my video. So I mean, the thing is that the law that I was talking about in 2021, let me just find its name, the US Sudan Democratic Transition Accountability and Fiscal Transparency Act, on the surface looks like a very supportive law. It calls for human rights in Sudan, it calls for democracy promotion, but it's just, and it calls for fiscal transparency. But actually the recent the decision made by the state to publicize the state-owned enterprises was in direct response to the demands for that fiscal transparency. And in general, yeah, that's the one. And in general, one of the you know, it's when you put that within the context of the history of the United States' behavior once it gets access to that law, and I gave the example of Bremer in 2003 in Iraq, then we wonder, what then is the United States going to demand to its partners in Sudan if, let's say, we have a full civilian government, that they do with the expropriated companies of the former regime, you know? And I'm looking here for exactly the part that so it says here, for example, they need to coordinate support to recover assets stolen from the Sudanese people. That's section 10 of the law. And they said number 1 means that they have to identify and track the assets taken from the people and institutions of Sudan through theft, corruption, money laundering, or other illicit means. And then it says, with respect to assets identified pursuant to paragraph 1, which is what I just said, we need to work with foreign governments and international organizations to A, share financial investigations intelligence. Okay, so we know where all this money is going. B, this is the part that's worrying, oversee and manage the assets identified. So the United States government working with foreign governments is tasking itself with the right to oversee and manage the assets that have been identified by the expropriation committee, and what are you going to do with that? You know, they say here that they're going to, in paragraph in number D, they say we're going to work with the government of Sudan to ensure that a credible mechanism is established to ensure that any recovered assets are managed in a transparent and accountable fashion and ultimately used for the benefit of the Sudanese people. But what is the benefit of the Sudanese people? Is the benefit of the Sudanese people, for example, giving these assets to companies that are of American origin? Or is it to give the assets to companies of economic or European origin, as they tried to do in Iraq? Or is it going to be something else? We don't know, you know? And I don't necessarily have the belief in the moral fortitude, you know, of our leaders to not be hoodwinked and to not further America's interests in that process. And so the struggle over the empowerment removal committees is also not just a struggle that's happening locally, but it's also a struggle that's international, you know. So these are just some of my concerns personally with that law. But also you have to put it within the history of the way that the United States has worked in countries that it's occupied, even though right now it's not necessarily occupying Sudan.
We're gonna close pretty quickly, but I also just want to ask one last question to represent the Sudanese diaspora that's present, specifically in the United States. Is there any direct actions that you guys think would be powerful, especially people that don't have a lot of community around them? Are there clear ways other than what was already said to express solidarity with the Sudanese people for the diaspora in the US?
Well, if I may jump on that, I think basically what kind of actions of solidarity are to be taken are dependent on our circumstances, right? So what we are able to do and how we can not just bring up the issues of the Sudanese revolution, but also use our access to the U.S. government to stop the kind of what I called before, you know, their imperialist interventions in the country. And I hope that these are the kind of things that the Sudanese diaspora will focus on mostly. And another thing that the Sudanese diaspora can do is to join liberation movements and movements for democracy that other diaspora groups are involved in, because tactically, there are things that are taking place in the region that are very connected, that it does not help us to isolate ourselves from understanding what's happening in the whole belt of Sudan that goes on. It's not just Sudan and Ethiopia and Chad and all the way. It's linked even in economic actions. Even the gold mining is taking place over all these countries, and the militia formation is taking place all over these countries and impacting us equally. And another thing, strategically, and from a principled point of view, we always need the support of those different groups, and therefore we need to give support as well. So to be more involved in liberation actions around of other groups is something that I would call the Sudanese diaspora to do more, just a bit more.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much to the both of you again. I think everybody is so enriched and inspired and amazed by the brilliance and the thoughtfulness and the really rigorous spirit that you both brought to this panel. So thank you again so much. And as you can see, I hope you're all scanning the comments because there's some really awesome love for the both of you. And so a reminder, next week, we'll be hosting our second webinar of the Black Internationalism Web Series, where we're going to be featuring Herman Weingai, who is a former political prisoner, a Nobel Peace Prize nominee, and leader of the nonviolent struggle in West Papua, Melanesia. Also, Mr. Weingai is a visiting scholar at George Mason University and a founder of the West Papua Human Rights Center, representative of the West Papua Melanesian people at the United Nations, and he continues his lobbying work at the US Congress and the United Nations on behalf of his people, Republic of West Melanesia. So we hope you'll join us to continue to be enriched and challenged and inspired by these amazing guests that we have. Feel free to follow us on Twitter and on Instagram at We Are Dissenters, and hopefully, you know, keep in touch with our panelists or keep in touch with any of us. And we hope you have a good rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.